Hey, this is Mr. Hoog, AP US History. Video lecture. Like I've been talking about most of the year, I'm finally getting it together. We're going to start with Chapter 15, a little bit beyond that. This is the ferment of reform and culture. The years say 1790 to 1860. We're looking at probably about 1820, maybe to 1850. There's a whole bunch of reform movements that are going to be going on during this time. And let's get started. By the way, as I go through this, I'm going to do the best I can without stuttering and stammering and all that kind of stuff. I'm not over preparing for this because I usually don't over prepare for class. So I'm going to be as natural as possible while doing this. If the production quality or my performance isn't the best, I'll get better as I do these. Pictures sitting in a room by yourself with a computer and a microphone in front of you and trying to explain things, it's a little different, so I'll get used to it. So, the Second Great Awakening. We already discussed this in class, and we already discussed why a lot of these reform movements and the Second Great Awakening and all that started, and it has to do with the massive industrialization after the War of 1812. And all of this change, not only the way you work, but the way people live. And when people experience enormous change, add to it, not only is the economy expanding, but people are moving west into the frontier, into places that have never been really settled. So there's a lot of unknowns, and a lot of things are going to make people anxious, nervous, and frankly scared. And throughout history, people will turn to their faith when they're trying to get answers to the unknown. So, this is a spiritual reform from within. It's deeply personal. And we'll talk about that a little bit further, how that's really different than the First Great Awakening and other religious movements of the past. This is a religious revivalism. And what is that going to yield? It's going to yield social reforms, and it's going to redefine what Americans believe equality is. And if you really think about it, American history, and when you look at equality, that definition definitely has changed and evolved over time, even to this day. So what are some of the movements? You've heard them all. The temperance movement, asylum and penal reform, abolitionism, which we're going to spend quite some time with, women's rights, and education. All of this is going to stem from the Second Great Awakening. Because within the Second Great Awakening, it's very personal, and it's going to drive people to look at the world that they live in, and within practice of their faith, which is deeply personal, they're going to work very hard to change things. And that is going to spark this huge, I would just say, group of reform movements that are still evolving and going on today. You can look at this period of time, and this really started a lot of movements that are still evolving and still are getting better and more refined even today. So, if we look at these different movements in American culture in the mid-1800s, well, nativism. Okay, what it had to do with immigration, this huge influx of immigration coming into the country. Revivalism, because of all the change, all the Western migration, all the change of people coming in this country, all the change of the Industrial Revolution. Romanticism, returning to nature and using nature to explain life. Which is a reaction against industrialization in the modern. We'll get more into that. Transcendentalism. Well, I can argue that transcendentalism takes romanticism to a different level. Also, these utopian communities. We're not going to spend a lot of time with them, but you need to understand it. Where people are trying to create this perfect life, this utopia. So the Second Great Awakening, you can look at this visual here. So, as a result of the Second Great Awakening, these revivals, what became the dominant, at the end of this, the dominant form of Christianity in America is going to be evangelical Protestantism. Now, what is that? We'll get more into what evangelical Protestantism is. But membership in these Protestant churches, Congregational, Presbyterian, Baptist, and Methodist, are going to soar. And by 1840, half the adult population is going to be connected to some church. And the Methodists are going to emerge as the largest denomination. Now, if you want to look at the next page, here is the denominational growth within the United States in 1780 to 1816. You'll see the Methodists and the number of congregations. Lutherans, that's going to be from German immigration, German Reform. Episcopal, not so much. Congregational, but you're going to see a huge, huge jump in these different congregations. So, revivalism in the social order. Society during the Jacksonian era was undergoing deep and rapid change, like we talked about at the beginning of this recording. There's this market revolution brought economic expansion and these periodic depressions. So you have the economy going up and down, up and down, up and down during this period. There's a lot of uneasiness. There's a lot of instability. To combat this uncertainty, reformists sought stability and order in religion. If it isn't going to be in the economy, in your change in your work life, these reformers will look for it in religion. It provided a means of social control in a disordered society. The churchgoers would value hard work, being on time or punctuality, sobriety. Revivals brought unity and strength and a sense of peace where everyone can come together and be able to deal with the changes in their society. Now let's look at one noted evangelical of the time was Charles Finney. He conducted these revivals in the mid-1820s and 1830s. And this comes to the heart of the Second Great Awakening. He rejected the Calvinist doctrine of predestination. He believed that believers, through free will, can achieve salvation. No more of this predestination stuff that we've talked about. And it really popularized this new form of revival. And the style of Finney and these revivals, you can even see today in many different evangelical Christian churches and movements throughout the United States. So this conversion experience of Finney, it's a new form of revival. And at these revivals, they would meet night after night to build excitement. Within this conversion experience, they would speak bluntly. They would pray for sinners by name, encouraged women to testify in public, and placing those struggling with conversion on the anxious bench at the front of the church. Now, what is this anxious bench? I think you can see one in this picture. You see the benches. Here's where Finney is speaking, and you see these benches up that are really close by. And here's another lithograph or visual where you see that these speakers were very, very animated. So we have different religious groups with different beliefs are going to emerge at this time. Quickly, Unitarians believed that Jesus was a great teacher, not the Son of God. A bit different. That God is a unity, not a trinity. Okay, that individuals can be close to God. Jesus was just a great teacher. He wasn't That's why he's taken it. It's called unity with God, not this Trinity of Father, Son, which would be Jesus, and Holy Ghost, a Spirit. Universalists believed in universal salvation. They even rejected the idea of hell. The Mormons, followers of Joseph Smith, and believed that God is coming and they need to build the kingdom on earth to receive him. And the Shakers believed in a communal life because they did not marry or have children. The church could only grow through converts, and as you read, that didn't really work out too well. So, also at this time, there's going to be a rise in African American churches. Revivalism is going to spread to the African American community. And the Second Great Awakening has been called the central and defining event in the development of Afro-Christianity. So the Second Great Awakening is where we're going to see the birth of African American churches. And even still today, and particularly through the 20th century, the African American church has been central to civil rights. Reverend Martin Luther King, a lot of other leaders in African American communities, political leaders, a lot of them started as preachers or reverends, the Reverend Jesse Jackson, the Reverend Al Sharpton. So to go back, during these revivals, Baptists and Methodists converted large numbers of blacks. So when this conversion in this Second Great Awakening was exploding, they were also looking to do the same with slaves and Africans, or African blacks, at the same time. So this led to the formation of all black Methodist and Baptist churches, primarily in the North. The African Methodist Episcopal, the AME, had 17,000 members by 1846. Other churches that were founded, while the Protestant revival sought to reform individual sinners, others sought to remake society at large. The Mormons. The real name, the other name, is the Church of Jesus Christ and Latter-day Saints, founded by Joseph Smith in western New York. And in 1827, Smith announced that he had discovered a set of golden tablets which was written the Book of Mormon, proclaiming that he had a commission from God to reestablish the true church. Smith gathered a group of devoted followers. Now, the Mormon culture upheld the middle-class values of hard work, self-control, and he tried to create a city of Zion, Kirkland, Ohio, Independence, Missouri, then to Nauvoo, Illinois. His unorthodox teachings led to persecution and mob violence. And we have somebody going around saying, well, we're going to establish the true church for God. Yeah, some of these Christian groups aren't going to really fly for that. Smith was murdered in 1844 by an anti-Mormon mob in Carthage, Illinois. So the church was in conflict. So you look at the timeline, just put that here of Joseph Smith. You can see that there. So after Joseph Smith is murdered, his successor is Brigham Young. I'm sure you've heard this name, Brigham Young University in Provo, Utah. He led the Mormons westward in 1846, 1847 to Utah, where they could live and worship without interference, and they're going to settle at the Great Salt Lake City. And there's a nice look at the Mormon Trail. See if anybody can tell me in class which former president. Don't look it up. It's from Independence, Missouri. So, also during this time, you're going to have an outburst of different cults. The one we look at is the Shakers. They use dancing as a worship practice. They practice celibacy and separating the sexes. They worked hard, lived simply. They were impressive with their order and cleanliness. The problem is they were celibate. They didn't get married. They didn't have children. So the only way they can keep on going is to convert. So at their peak, around 1850, 6,000 members, and they're basically going to die out because they were celibate and they didn't marry and have families. There's a look at a Shaker meeting. Looks like they're probably dancing there. So we look at this whole concept of purifying the nation, religiously or ecclesiastically is the right term. So this age of reform from 1790 to 1860, okay, this is what we call antebellum America. You should know this from US 1. It means before the Civil War. It's also, when you look at it from a literary sense, the Romantic Age. And then, of course, the Second Great Awakening around the same time. These reformers pointed out the inequality in society, stating the Declaration of Independence as the basis of their argument. The rise of Unitarians who believed a God of love instead of the Puritan concept of an angry God. So it is a reaction against Puritanism, predestination, the angry God, and it's more about self-salvation, rejecting predestination, and this God isn't angry. This God is a God of love. Unitarians believed one can show the love of God by helping others. So you can see where the different reform movements are going to be established and really start to take off because of that Unitarian belief. They developed a social conscience for improving the quality of life in society. Reformers questioned the value of material progress in an age of industrialization if it were not accompanied by progress in solving the important human problems. Okay? So it's all well and good, I guess, material project, but is it really solving important human problems? If it's just for making money, a lot of the reformers would really question it. And if this industrialization and this progress is actually hurting people, even more of a problem. This is primarily a northern movement. You're not going to see the reformers taking hold in the South because they'd be very suspicious, because many of these reformers of these different movements are going to be abolitionists, and it's not going to be very cool in Southern society for you to be a reformer, because the fear is going to be, okay, all right, you're going to come after slavery. So just keep that in mind, and that's why it's very much northern. Southerners resisted reform movements because they feared, again, abolition of slavery. I'm ahead of the PowerPoint here. So reformers also sought to purify the nation by removing the sins of slavery. Intemperance, that means remove alcohol. Male domination, women's rights. And war, pacifism. You'll see with Henry David Thoreau and the Transcendentalists, particularly Thoreau, anti-war as immoral and something that should be avoided. And you should use civil disobedience to resist. Some removed themselves from society and tried to create these utopian societies based on collective ownership, which is basically socialism or communism. So a lot of the seeds of communism or socialism in the United States can be found in these utopian communities. Reformers also use education, lyceum meetings, newspapers, and to inform the public of their issues. Okay, so they're not just going to be like, there's going to be an organized effort to get this message out, mostly in the written word and by different meetings of different groups and societies throughout the North. So education reform in 1800, Massachusetts was the only state requiring free public schools supported by community funds. In a town like Seekonk, at the time, there might have been one, maybe two houses Where I used to live on County in Chestnut Street in the corner, that years and years and years ago used to be a school for the neighborhood. And it isn't what we see today with our high school and 2 floors and a bunch of classrooms and everybody. There'll be a lot smaller schools because transportation was more by walking. Okay? But community funds, you go to the town meeting every year and you appropriate some money to pay the teacher or a couple teachers or 3 or 4 teachers throughout your town. And the kids within the area, didn't matter by grade, would come to the schoolhouse and they'd get their schooling. Middle-class reformers called for tax-supported education, arguing to business leaders that the new economic order needed educated workers. Okay? One good way to get it, who was really driving the government in a sense, was this industrial revolution that was exploded. Or to flip it the other way around, the government was more concerned about the industrial revolution, the American system, building a vibrant economy that's going to compete in the world. So in order to get the politicians to listen, you got to go to the businesses. Look, you need an educated workforce for a lot of things you need them to do. Under Horace Mann's leadership in the 1830s, Massachusetts created a state board of education and adopted a minimum length school year. And they provided for the training of teachers and expanded the curriculum to include subjects such as history, thank you, and geography. So Massachusetts is where it started, guys. Massachusetts has been a leader in public education. Before public education, only those that could afford it would send their children to private schools or tutors. And then, families that tended to be more, didn't have the money, it was more self-taught, like Abraham Lincoln. There wasn't money in his family. They couldn't send him off to school. So he was self-taught with the help of his stepmother. So education was a family responsibility. I mean, I still argue it is, but public education, and actually for a certain amount of time, children are supposed to go to school for a certain amount of time for a certain amount of days a year. So by the 1850s, the number of schools, attendance figures, and school budgets had all increased sharply. School reformers enjoyed their greatest success in the Northeast and the least in the South. Southern planters opposed paying taxes to educate poorer white children. The attitude was, they're not my kids. I'll educate my own. Everyone's responsible for educating their own kids. There's people that believe that today. So understand that public education, what we know it now, it's only about 160 years old in the United States, and in pretty much, I would say, in the world, the whole concept of public education. Before that, it was the family, somehow, some way, try to educate their kids and themselves. Educational opportunities for women also expanded. In 1833, Oberlin College in Ohio became the first co-educational college where it wasn't just men. It was women too. 4 years later, the first all-female college was founded, Mount Holyoke College in Mount Holyoke, Massachusetts. Women educators, Emma Willard. Okay. Troy, New York, the female seminary, the curriculum, math, physics, history, geography. And the whole purpose was to train female teachers. There's Mary Lyons. In 1837, she established Mount Holyoke in South Hadley, Mass. as the first college for women. Some of the things that you would read, the McGuffey Eclectic Readers, are different lessons within this book. McGuffey's third eclectic reader. They go in a series, and these were the books that a lot of students and teachers would use in class would use. And they would use religious parables to teach American values. And why? Because the children knew the religious parables from going to church. You got to understand, vast majority of children in New England or in the North went to church on Sunday. So when you try to teach what those parables are already familiar with, there's some sort of familiarity. Teach the middle class morality and respectful order in these McGuffey readers. Teach the 3 R's plus the Protestant ethic. So the 3 R's are reading, writing, arithmetic, right? The Protestant ethic is frugality, hard work, and sobriety. And if you read these McGuffey eclectic readers, those are the things that it's going to teach. I'm going to have to get a hold of one of those. And so, again, the age of reform. We're going to move on here. You can see in this cartoon, you see in the bottom, gin, rum, brandy, and whiskey. Yeah, it's temperance. We're going to go a little further on that. First, the asylum movement. When you talk about asylum, you're talking about orphanages, jails, and hospitals. You're not talking about insane asylums. And when we see that word, that's what we think of. Orphanages, jails, and hospitals. So they isolated and separated the criminal, yes, the insane, the ill, and the dependent from outside society. Okay? So this rehabilitation, the goal of care in asylums which had focused on confinement, shifted to the reform of personal character. For instance, the asylum in Seekonk today is the corner of Fieldwood and Miller Street. I think it's an architectural yellow house now. That was the asylum. It was more for those that were dependents, widows or children that were dependents. It was more, the asylum was more for those that were under economic hardship. So the asylum movement, Dorothea Dix, a Boston school teacher, took the lead in advocating state-supported asylums for the mentally ill specifically. She attracted much attention to the movement by a report detailing the horrors to which the mentally ill were subjected. Being chained, kept in cages and closets, and beaten with rods. In response to her efforts, 28 states maintained mental institutions by 1860. So understand, the asylum movement is not just about the mentally ill. However, Dorothea Dix in particular, when you look at the real horrors of mental institutions, or what they were called insane asylums and how they were treated, they're basically treated as animals. So there's going to be mental institutions with a certain type of reform. Also, the temperance movement is very important in the 19th century, and it's going to culminate at its zenith to prohibition. That's going to go into effect on New Year's Day, 1920. So the most significant reform movements of the period sought not to withdraw from society, but to change it directly. Okay? They're not going to say, we're not going to have anything, so let's move away from alcohol. That's almost impossible. They try to change it directly. So what is the temperance movement? It undertook to eliminate social problems by curbing drinking. Led largely by the clergy, the movement at first focused on drunkenness and did not oppose moderate drinking. In 1826, the American Temperance Society was founded, taking voluntary abstinence as its goal. So understand, originally, it's to curb it down, get rid of drunkenness. Too many men that were head of household, that means the person that's bringing money into the household, particularly in cities or in industrial areas, would go get their paycheck and they go to the saloon. Not necessarily a good thing. So if it's drunkenness, it causes all kinds of problems. You're not feeding your family, you're not paying your rent, you're not taking care of your wife. And then if you're drunk, here's some other problems. Child neglect, child abuse, spousal neglect and abuse. and a whole host of other problems that go along with drunkenness in saloons. Use your imagination. Gambling, prostitution, and all. There's so many ancillary problems that go along with the problems with uncontrolled abuse or use of alcohol. So, some of the players in this temperance movement, Lyman Beecher, Neil Dow, Lucretia Mott, eventually became an anti-alcohol movement. Temperance wasn't, by the mid-1820s, heading towards 1830, was more about, abstinence from alcohol. It's not cool to drink. Not only just be sober or have it under control, how about not drink at all? People would sign pledges, pamphlets, anti-alcohol tract. There's a publication, 10 Nights in a Barroom and What I Saw There. Really scare people and to shame people from what goes on. Demon Drink, Adopt 2 Major Line Attack. And stress temperance and individual will to resist. This is a huge problem. If you look, during the next decade, approximately 5,000 local temperance societies were founded. As the movement gained momentum, annual per capita consumption of alcohol dropped sharply. Okay? So it did work. And here is the drunkard's progress over time. You'll see all the different steps. You look all the way down to step 9. It looks like the guy's shooting himself. So, and progressively, if you look at it visually, it gets worse. So, let's look at this this classical view of a model republic. That's what the United States is a democratic republic. The virtuous republic that we talked about, that the framers talked about, that virtue was essential for a republic to succeed. Okay, so the virtuous republic or moral excellence. The ideal citizen, according to Cincinnatus. Roman statesman, regarded as a model of simple virtue. He twice was called to assume dictatorship of Rome, and each time retired to his farm. City on a Hill, our friend John Winthrop. Enlightenment thinking, all of these things, all these influences, this virtuous republic. First, government gets its authority from the citizens. The citizenry is selfless and educated. Elections should be frequent. Government should guarantee individual rights and freedoms. Government's power should be limited. The need for a written constitution. E pluribus unum, I'm terrible with this, out of many one. An important role for women, raise good virtuous citizens, or this idea of Republican womanhood. Well, let's look at 19th century women. They were unable to vote. They had the legal status of a minor. Single woman could own her own property, but once married, no control over her property or her children. Could not initiate divorce. Remember we looked at Andrew Jackson's soon-to-be wife, Rachel, was in a divorce, a bad marriage, wanted a divorce, and he wouldn't grant it to her first husband, for a long time. Why? Because men had to initiate the divorce. They couldn't make wills, sign a contract, or bring suit in court without her husband's permission. So this whole separate spheres concept, this Republican motherhood, evolved into the cult of domesticity that you learned about in US 1. A woman's sphere was in the home. It was a refuge from the cruel world outside. That was the belief. Her role was to civilize her husband and family. An 1830s minister said, "The power of woman is her dependence. A woman who gives up the dependence on man to become a reformer yields the power God has given her for her protection, and her character becomes unnatural." The call to domesticity equals slavery. So look at this concept. The Second Great Awakening inspired women to improve society. The Grimke sisters, they were Southern abolitionists. Pretty brave ladies right there. Lucy Stone, American Women's Suffrage Association, and edited Woman's Journal. Okay? A lot of this, the early women's movement, the women that were part of this were abolitionists first and foremost. They look at freeing slaves and then they look at themselves. Well, their status in American society isn't much different than a slave. So, when abolitionists divided over the issue of female participation, women found it easy to identify with the situation of the slaves. And this reform led to the Seneca Falls Convention of 1848. Why was it significant? It launched the modern women's rights movement and established the arguments and the program for the women's rights movement for the remainder of the century, and I'll argue even up till today. So there's going to be a split in 1840, okay, in London, the World Anti-Slavery Convention. And you have Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And in 1848, the Seneca Falls Declaration of Sentiments. It was the first women's rights movement in New York in 1849. Educational and professional opportunities, property rights, legal equality, repeal of laws awarding the father custody of the children in divorce, suffrage rights. That means the right to vote, not to suffer. And the following is an excerpt from the Seneca Falls Declaration written by Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And you can read this on your own with a copy. I'm just going to go through it quick. I'm not even going to read it. Notice that the language and wording is similar to the Declaration of Independence. As you can see, it's very close to the Declaration. This passage also. The next one. He is taken from all right and property, even the wages he earns. It's like the indictment put on King George III in the Declaration. When they talk about he, they're talking about male domination, a patriarchal society. There's more there and there. You can read that on your own. So Susan B. Anthony on marriage and slavery. I'm not going to read this either, but about married women and their legal status. It's pretty much the same as servitude and being a slave. Basically how women in the society are owned by their husbands. What it would be like if ladies had their own way. There you go. Women taking off in the carriage and the men are at home with the babies and washing and knitting and taking care of the kids. I do that quite a bit. Yeah. And here's another one. Down with the men. There you go. The utopian community, just real quick. The Oneida community, we won't look at them. A second for Brook Farm, since it was in Massachusetts. And then the Transcendentalists. So these secular utopian communities, they're not related to religion. You're looking at individual freedom, which is spontaneity and self-fulfillment, is going to clash with the demands of community life, discipline, and organizational hierarchy. And when you look at particular, like Brook Farm, that's the kind of a society that's being put together. So there's that clash. Robert Owen and the Utopian Socialist, this village of cooperation. It's basically socialism or communism. It's a commune. where everybody's basically equal, they work together, and they share equally. So these utopian communities where everyone is equal and everyone is prospering and everyone is doing well. There's the original plans for New Harmony, Indiana. New Harmony in 1832, and here's what it looks like. Not necessarily today, but probably still looks the same. What I really like to focus on is transcendentalism a little bit. And those of you that had me freshman year, we spent some time on this. Liberation from understanding and the cultivation of reasoning. Transcend the limits of intellect and allow the emotions, the soul, to create an original relationship with the universe. In other words, people find truth in nature, and people find truth with their humanity as being human with nature. It's a reaction against what? Okay? It's a reaction against the modern world. So the thinking is man must acknowledge a body of moral truths that were intuitive and must transcend more sensational proof. The infinite benevolence of God, the infinite benevolence of nature, the divinity of man, not just God, but man. Man is divine since a lot of them believe since they're created by God. They instinctively rejected all secular authority and the authority of organized churches and the scriptures of law or of conventions. Anything that was organized was to be suspect with the transcendentalists. So it takes away from the divinity of man, where man, through their experience with nature and being close to nature, is at the heart of transcendentalism. Transcendentalism can be looked at as the American version of European Romanticism. Therefore, if man was divine, it would be wicked that he should be held in slavery, or his soul corrupted by superstition, or his mind clouded by ignorance. Thus, the role of the reformer was to restore man to that divinity which God had endowed them, or given to him. It's just a different way of thinking. What's the transcendentalist agenda? Give freedom to the slave, give well-being to the poor and the miserable, give learning to the ignorant, give health to the sick, give peace and justice to society. Who are the writers? The main writers out of Concord, Massachusetts. Ralph Waldo Emerson wrote Nature in 1832, Self-Reliance in 1841, The American Scholar in 1837, then Henry David Thoreau, Walden in 1854, and Resistance to Civil Disobedience in 1849. Especially Resistance to Civil Disobedience is going to be hugely influential, not only in the United States for the Civil Rights Movement, but before that with Mahatma Gandhi and India's independence from Great Britain as their colonial power. And here you can see where these different utopian type of communities were throughout the United States. You see a lot of them in New York, quite a few in Massachusetts, a lot of Shakers in Massachusetts, especially Western Mass. Owenites, and then other types of groups. That's it for this one. I'll be looking for your feedback on this. I hope this has been helpful, and I will see you next time. Thanks.